All right, if you have a Bible with you this morning and you haven't already done so, I invite you to take it out and join me in the book of Revelation. And we're going to be in Revelation chapter 11 specifically this morning. So Revelation chapter 11. It's been 3 weeks since we last studied the book of Revelation together. I have enjoyed, as a teacher, a little break, having worshiped in a couple of different locations here over the last several weeks. But I really enjoyed this week getting back into the studies, and I'm excited to be able to teach this class here this morning. I have a lot of fun doing the in-depth study for this particular class, and I hope that you are enjoying some of the fruit of it as we study together. But as we noted the last time we were together, our experience in studying the book of Revelation, in many ways, it's kind of like the last text that we look at in Revelation chapter 10. Remember where John was handed the scroll and was told to eat it. And what was his experience when he ate that scroll? It was sweet to his mouth, but it was kind of bitter in his stomach, right? And so that's kind of, I think, what our study of the book of Revelation is like. We are studying God's truth here. We are understanding the things that are to come, and it is sweet in the aspect of we enjoy pursuing truth, we enjoy learning truth and taking these things in, but because it is a message ultimately of judgment before the salvation comes at the end, sometimes it is a little bit bitter. And so we share in John's experience in that particular way. Since we are coming back here from a little bit of a break, let me kind of tell you how the rest of this class is going to go between now and the end of May. We're currently here in the middle of April. Today is April the 14th. We only have 5 Sundays left before we hit our summer session of classes. Obviously, we're only in chapter 11. And we started all the way back in September, okay? So if it took us from September to now to get 10 chapters underneath our belt, we're not going to finish 10 more or 11 more between now and the end of May. So what is that going to mean for our class? Well, what we're going to try to do for the remaining 5 weeks is we're going to get just as far as we're able to go, moving about at the pace that we've been moving at. But then I'm going to take a break for the summer, and we will resume this class next fall. Now, Lord willing, we will finish this class, we will finish this study, but we're going to have a little break in there before we get there. Jay has already planned the summer session of classes. We often all meet together and have kind of one-off classes, as well as I think maybe some interviews that we are hoping to do this summer of our members like we have done in the past. And so my guess is we're probably going to get about up to the portion where the 7 bowls of wrath are to be talked about and poured out. And that's probably where we'll stop. And then we'll come back in the fall, in September, and we'll pick up there and we'll just keep on going. And we'll see the end judgments. We'll see the millennial reign of Christ. We'll see the new heavens and the new earth and all the exciting things that come at the end of the book. And I'll look forward to finishing it with you in that way. I think it will probably take me from September till Christmas around that time. And we may not hit it exactly, but I can always find more things to talk about, I can assure you. So we'll figure out a way to stretch the time. But I wanted to give you a little progress of how this class is going to go for the next few months. This morning we are going to resume where we last left off. We stopped our study the last time at the end of chapter 10, but if you're like me, even as a teacher, whenever you leave here, if you're not continually reading these things and putting your mind in them, you probably forgot a little bit about where we were and what happened. And so I want to take a few minutes here at the beginning of class to kind of remind you of where we left off, and that will launch us into our discussion here in the morning, this morning. We are in the middle of an interlude here in the book of Revelation. I've been telling you all along with these 3 sets of 7 that come in the book, the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and then the 7 bowls. In each of the presentation of these, there are always 6 that will come, and then there's an interlude between number 6 and number 7. When it came to the seals that were opened, that interlude came for us in chapter 7, and we saw there the presentation of the 144,000 Jews who are sealed on the earth for this final time period, as well as, in the next section, a great number of Gentiles who are pictured in heaven who are there waiting the vindication of the resurrection. So the first 6 seals happened in chapter 6. That was followed by an interlude in chapter 7. And then we saw the 7th seal opened in chapter 8. And you remember there was silence in heaven for 30 minutes because of the shock and the awe of what was about to happen in the trumpets. Then in chapters 8 and 9, we had the presentation of the 7 trumpet blasts. 6 of them anyways. And with those trumpet blasts, we saw the beginning of the day of the Lord judgments. Okay, those judgments included vast destruction to the ecology of the earth, a third of the trees, a third of the forest, a third of the grass, and all that kind of stuff. And somebody speaking in tongues over there. What kind of church do you think this is? And do you want me to interpret? That's the biblical rules, you know. But then when we saw trumpets 5 and 6 being blown, we saw a supernatural form of judgment begin. The abyss was opened, and the demons were allowed to come out of the abyss and to torment unbelievers for a period of time, for 5 months, I believe it said. And then in the 6th seal, there is a 200 million army of angels who are to bring death to, I think it was a third of the world's population at that particular time. So chapter 10 then brought us into the second interlude that comes at the end of these trumpets. And in the interlude, we saw John have another incredible vision. Okay, he sees an enormous, glorious angel. And so big was this angel that it had 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land, and it proclaimed that whenever the 7th trumpet is blown, the mystery of God will then be completed. And the 7th trumpet is what we're going to see in the coming weeks, is it's going to usher in the final judgments of the book of Revelation, and those final judgments are the 7 bowls of God's wrath. But not only was the angel standing half on the sea and half on the land, but he also had a scroll in his hand. That scroll, I think, is the same scroll that the Lamb unsealed back in chapter 5. Okay, the one that God was holding on the throne. And he tells John, I want you to eat that scroll. And the scroll, as we noted, was sweet to his taste, but then bitter to his stomach. Why? Because that scroll represents God's plan to take back the rightful rulership of the earth, which is a good and sweet thing, but it's going to involve horrendous judgments to make that happen, which is why it turns bitter in his stomach. And so John is told at the end of chapter 10, he is once again going to have to prophesy, as he's done before, about many peoples, languages, and kings. So that brings us up to chapter 11, which will be the focus of our study here this morning. We are still in chapter 11 in the midst of this interlude. We are waiting for the 7th trumpet to be blown. But as we do so, John is going to give us information here today about 2 preachers, not sanctimonious preachers like we talked about this morning, right? But 2 preachers, or we could call them 2 witnesses, who are going to be raised up in the last 3.5 year period of this end time event, okay? And there are some pretty fascinating things to consider as we look at their ministry, I should say, and I look forward to exploring it with you here this morning. So with all that back in our mind, let's read our text here that we're going to look at. We're going to look at chapter 11, verse 1 through 14, and that will be the primary subject of our class here this morning. So let's just take a moment to read this together, either in your Bibles or on the screen if you want to follow along. I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and I was told, go and measure the temple and the altar and its worshipers. But exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. There's some of those time periods that we keep noting here, okay? And I will appoint my witnesses, my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. Now you'll note that's the same time period, just said in a different way. 42 months, 1,260 days, it all equals 3.5 years, okay? If you're counting on a 360-day calendar as they were at that time. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. He's talking about these witnesses. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die, and they will have the power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time that they are prophesying, and they will have power to turn the waters into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want to. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of power? Huh? That's some kind of power. Verse 7. Now, when they had finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower them and kill them. And their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. He's talking about Jerusalem, okay? Where their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and will refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts. Oh, isn't that something? They're going to celebrate by sending each other gifts when these 2 witnesses die, because these 2 prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck them. They're now sorry that they celebrated this. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies looked on. And at that very hour there was a severe earthquake, and 1/10 of the city collapsed, again Jerusalem. 7,000 people are killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified, and they gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past, and the third one is coming. All right, pretty interesting text here. Certainly some things that are in need of explanation, okay? And so our outline this morning is going to follow 2 simple sections of thought, if you're a note taker and like to keep track of these things. First, we're going to talk about the city, and then we are going to talk about the witnesses, okay? The city, the section on the city is pretty short, just verses 1 and 2. But the section on the witnesses is fairly lengthy. It goes from verse 3 to verse 14. So let's look first at the city in verses 1 and 2. The text actually begins with John becoming a part of the action, and that happens sometimes here in the book of Revelation. Sometimes he's just a passive observer who is watching the things that are taking place before him, but sometimes he is invited to become a part of the action. And in this particular instance, John is given a measuring line, and he is told to enter into the vision and to do something in it, and that is, he is to measure the temple of God, and he is to measure the worshipers within the temple of God. Now, a couple of things worth noting here. First of all, this measuring line, it would have been it wouldn't have been like a tape measure like you and I think of today. It would have been probably a kind of reed that was used in that area for multiple different purposes. A reed that kind of grew in the swamplands in and around likely the Jordan River basin. Sometimes these reeds could be used for walking sticks. Sometimes they could be used to be whittled down to be used as a writing tool. But because these reeds tended to be long and straight, they were often used as tools of measurement. And that's what's taking place here in this opening vision of chapter 11. John is given a measuring line, and perhaps it is the same angel that handed him the scroll who is now handing this measuring line to him and asking him to go and to measure the temple in Jerusalem. Now the question is, which temple is he being told to measure? And you might be tempted to think it was the temple of his day, but let's just remember there was no temple in John's day. If the book of Revelation is written when we think that it was, which was somewhere in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, 95, 96 AD, the temple was no longer standing and had not been standing for 26 years. It was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Okay? So which temple is he being asked to measure? I think he's being asked to measure in a vision here the temple that will exist in the future. There have been 5 total temples that either have or will exist for God and the Jewish people. There was the original one that was built by Solomon. There was the second one that was built by Zerubbabel. This is after they came back from the Babylonian captivity. There was the third one that was built by King Herod. That was close to the time of Jesus' day. Then there is a fourth one that will be built in the future in the reign of the Messiah, what we call the millennial kingdom, because Christ is going to rule from Jerusalem, and he's going to rule from the Holy of Holies in that final temple. And so that leaves 4, or that makes 4 if you're counting along. So we're missing one. And the missing one, I think, is the temple that is going to be built in the final days of the present age that we are living in. Okay? This temple will be the temple that the Antichrist will eventually come to, and he will try to rule from the temple. It will be rebuilt sometime before Christ comes back. And my guess is it probably will not be built until the Antichrist makes a peace treaty with them in that final 7-year period that we've often talked about. Okay? So I think this is what John is told to measure, but the question is, why is he told to measure it? Well, this is not the only occasion in Scripture where a prophet is told to measure the city of Jerusalem or to measure the temple. It actually happens multiple times in the Old Testament. One reason why a prophet is told to measure out either the city or the temple is because they're measuring it out for judgment. Let me give you an example on the screen here from Amos chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, "What do you see, Amos?" "A plumb line," I replied. And the Lord said, "Look, I am setting a plumb line among my people of Israel. I will spare them no longer." Okay? So here, a plumb line or a measuring line is obviously used for judgment. God is measuring the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and he is preparing to judge Israel for their wickedness. But then if you go to the book of Zechariah, another measurement is used, but this time it's used to measure off God's people for a different purpose, not for judgment, but this time for salvation. Listen to Zechariah chapter 2. Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand, and I asked, "Where are you going with that?" And he answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and long it is." While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said, "Go run and tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals that are in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." So here, God is measuring the city, but he's measuring it so that he can protect it. Do you see that in the text? The future of city of Jerusalem from Zechariah's day is a city without walls. Guess what Jerusalem is today? A city without walls, right? But God himself says he will be a wall of fire, of protection around it. Okay, so what I want you to see there is the measuring line can be either for judgment or for salvation. The question is, all right, which one are we talking about here in Revelation chapter 11? And the answer, I'm quite convinced, is it is a measurement for salvation. Okay? Remember, one of the themes that we've been exploring as we have been studying these end-time events is that there is a remnant among the actual ethnic people of Israel who is going to be saved in the final days. 2/3 of the people of Israel, that's the book of Zechariah tells us, will perish in the final judgments of these days, but 1/3 will be brought through it, will be brought through terrible times, and they will return to the Lord either before he comes back or at the moment that he comes back when they see him coming in the sky. And that seems to be what is foreshadowed here in this vision. The temple is being measured. Also, he tells them to measure the worshipers within the temple. And that the worshipers there are symbolic of the true worshipers of God among Israel who will be protected in those final days. Certainly that will include the 144,000 who have been sealed for their particular purpose, but it also will include all the other Jews who will turn to Christ in the final years of this age, in my opinion. But there's one other thing to notice about this measurement. It excludes the outer court. Okay, you might ask, what is the outer court? The outer court is the area in which the Gentiles are allowed to come to. You can see here on the screen, the court of Gentiles is out in that outside open area. The temple complex had several stages within it. In the outer areas, anyone could come into that area if they were a God-fearing person. So it didn't matter if you were a Gentile, a Greek, or whatever else, you could come into that particular area. But then inside of there, where you see the buildings start to be and the walls start to be erected on the inside, there was the court where only the Israelites could come. And in what you see called the women's court here, both men and women were allowed to come into that particular part of the temple. But then there is an area inside of that where the little golden doors are and the little bridgeway in between there before you get to the main temple part. That would be where the Israelite men were allowed to come for worship. And inside of there, once you actually get inside of the building, you have the holy place where only the priests could go for worship. And then inside of there, in the very back of the building, you have the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest can go to worship, and only once a year for that particular part. Okay, but it is this outer court, the court of the Gentiles, that John is told not to include in his measurement. And the question is, okay, why not include it? And I think it's because it is symbolic of what is going to take place in those final days. Ever since the time of the Babylonian captivity, 500 years, 560 some years before Christ came, we have been in what is called the times of the Gentiles. And that means that Jerusalem has been under the control or sovereignty of one Gentile nation or another, and not under Israel's control. Babylon was the first to control it, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome. Later the Turks took over it, then the British ruled over it, and most recently the Arabs have ruled over it, and now the city of Jerusalem itself is split, half of it being ruled by Israel, half of it under the possession of the Arabs. So the final manifestation of Gentile domination of Jerusalem is still yet to come, and it is going to come under the reign of the Antichrist. The Antichrist himself will be a Gentile of some sort. We don't know what his nationality will be. And while it is going to be true that he makes a deal with Israel in the first half of his time period there, and I think it's during that time that they will likely be able to rebuild the temple, it's also true that he does not do it in good faith. He does not do it in true worship. As a matter of fact, he is actually going to come into that temple, and he is going to say, remember we talked about a statue of Zeus being set up that was the abomination that causes desolation. That's going to repeat itself, but it'll be a statue of himself who will be put into this temple, and he will want people to worship him as God. Okay. So at the end of verse 2, we learn that the Gentiles are going to trample the city of Jerusalem for 42 months. Here is the final 3.5-year period that we have talked about a number of times, the last 3.5 years of that final 7-year period. In the first 3.5 years, the Antichrist will make peace with Israel. This will likely be the time, I think, that they will rebuild the temple. But in the middle of that final period, he will come to Jerusalem and he will seek to rule from there, and he will want to be worshipped. And this is what will bring about what is called the abomination that causes desolation. And I think it's for that reason that John is told, don't measure the outer court. Don't measure where the Gentiles are, because it is the Gentiles who are going to bring this trouble upon the people of Israel in that final period of days. Okay? So that tells us a little bit about the city, if you're following the outline, and what will happen in those final 3.5 years, and John is told to measure it for that purpose. The rest of the text here this morning is going to tell us about something else special that is going to happen in those last 3.5 years. God is going to call forth 2 witnesses, 2 preachers, if you will, who are going to preach both judgment and salvation in this final period. So look at verse 3 again in your text if you've got it open there to you. And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. So here's a brand new thought in our study of the book of Revelation. We are introduced now to 2 characters that we have not seen up until this particular point. These 2 witnesses will minister in the last 42 months of this particular period. 42 months is 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. Who are these witnesses? Well, a couple things that we need to take note of. First, in verse 4, they are referred to as the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the presence of the Lord. Okay? And if your Bible is like mine, there's quotations around those 2 phrases, the 2 olive trees or the 2 lampstands. And that is a reference to a specific passage of Scripture. I'd like for you to turn in your Bibles with me, if you would, for a moment, to Zechariah chapter 4. And I want to show you where this originally comes from. Just to give you kind of a brief setting here of the book of Zechariah, Zechariah is one of the 3 final prophets of the Old Testament period, and it's a book that actually comes after the Babylonian captivity, after the Israelites come back to Jerusalem. Zechariah is there, and also before Zechariah is a prophet named Haggai. They were both written at the same time, and they were both ministering for the same particular purpose. They were trying to motivate Israel to rebuild the temple, because Israel had become discouraged. If you remember the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Israelites had come back to the land of Israel. They had begun to build their temple. They had laid the foundation and all that kind of stuff, but then they began to meet opposition as all the nations around them didn't want them to complete this temple, and they put up a problem for them. So they quit. And they quit for nearly 20 years. Okay, just leaving the temple as it was. And so God sends 2 prophets to try to motivate them to get on with the business. One of those is Haggai, and the other one is Zechariah, which I have had you turn to here. There were 2 other men who were also important at this particular time period. One was a man by the name of Joshua, who was the high priest at this particular time, and the other was a man named Zerubbabel, who was the governor of Jerusalem at this time. They didn't have a king, but Zerubbabel was the government. Zechariah chapter 4, and what we're about to read here, it speaks to the ministry of these 2 men, Joshua and Zerubbabel, and the ministry they had in rallying the people to rebuild the temple. Let's read a little bit of this together. Zechariah chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Then the angel who talked with me returned and woke me up like someone had been awakened from sleep. And he asked me, "What do you see?" Zechariah is having a vision here, much like John is in the book of Revelation. Okay. And I answered, "I see a gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lamps or 7 stems that come out from it, with 7 channels to those lamps. Also there are" what? 2 olive trees by it, one on the right and one on the left. Okay? Much like John in the book of Revelation, Zechariah is having a vision. He actually has a series of 8 visions all in one night. And he's sleeping before this one happens because you get the sense he's exhausted by all these visions that he's had previous to it, okay? But when he wakes up, he's asked to describe what he sees. And what he sees is a big golden lampstand. Think of a candelabra, a Jewish candelabra sort of thing. And there are 7 limbs. There's a bowl down in the center of it. And from this bowl, there are 7 stems that come up that create 7 lamps or 7 lights. This big bowl is a storage container for olive oil, because the olive oil is what they use to burn in the lamps. And this big bowl is constantly fed by these 2 olive trees that are on either side of the lamp, and they're constantly pumping oil into the lamp so that it's always fed. And if we were to read on and had time this morning, we would show that what this is meant to represent is this is a picture of God's Spirit that is being channeled through the ministry of 2 men who are called the olive trees, Joshua and Zerubbabel, the governor and the high priest. These 2 men, by the help of the Spirit, are leading Israel to rebuild the temple. Okay? Now, with that in mind, I want you to come back to Revelation chapter 11, and I want you to see what the parallel is. The text tells us that God has appointed 2 witnesses to prophesy in this last 3.5-year period, and they are called the 2 olive trees in verse 4, because just like in Zechariah's day, God is channeling His Spirit through the ministry of these 2 people. Now, unlike in Zechariah's day, these 2 preachers are not trying to motivate people to rebuild the temple. That's already happened at this particular point. Instead, they are preaching to the nations. They are preaching to the Gentiles who have taken control of the temple and are blaspheming the name of God from the temple. And they're judging the Gentiles because of this. Now, this will obviously cause a lot of trouble, okay? No one likes to have judgment preached at them. And so, in order to protect them, God gives them the power to strike anyone down who comes against them with fire. Again, wouldn't you like to have that ability? I'd do a lot more evangelism if I could just, if anybody could, if they contradicted me, I'd just strike them down with fire. I could be an effective evangelist if I had that particular ability. Okay. So that some of us would stay home. That's right. Yeah, you'd have to try it out at least once, wouldn't you? Yeah, I think you would. I think I would have to. All right, so that tells us who they are from a biblical point of view. It's from a reference. They share a common identity with Zerubbabel and Joshua from the time of Zechariah. But the question is, can we know anything specifically about the identity of who these 2 preachers are? And the short answer to that is no, we can't. The text never tells us, never gives us a sure identity of who these 2 people are. But there are a couple of hints that allow us to at least make a guess. We don't want to be dogmatic about our guess. We don't want to say we know for sure this is who it is, but it is a somewhat educated guess, I guess you would say, that a lot of scholars make. There are many people today who think these 2 witnesses will be Moses and Elijah. Okay, and there are several reasons why they say that will be the case. Number one, notice the kind of things that these men are allowed to do while they're preaching. We've already said that they'll be able to call down fire from heaven and destroy people, and is that not what Elijah did? He not call down fire from heaven in his ministry when he went to battle with the prophets of Baal? You remember that story. Also, it says in verse 6 that these witnesses have the power to shut up the heavens so there'll be no rain during this particular 3.5-year period. And now I'm not sure if that means no rain anywhere on the earth. That's sort of hard to believe. My guess is it means no rain in Jerusalem, where the Antichrist is ruling from. And in the story of Elijah, is that not what he did over Israel? He prayed that it would not rain for 3.5 years, and it did not do that in his particular era of prophecy. Also mentioned is their ability to turn water into blood and to bring about any kind of plague that they please. Who had the power to turn water into blood and plagues in the Old Testament? Moses, yeah. So that alone could be very powerful evidence that these are the identity of these two people that we're talking about. But there are a couple of other pieces that kind of add to the intrigue. As you know, both Moses and Elijah had some mysterious circumstances around their death. Elijah actually never died. He was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind in the chariots of fire. And Moses, he did die, but his body was supernaturally buried by God because God didn't want anybody to know where Moses was buried. They didn't want the people of Israel to make a shrine out of his particular place of burial. And there's that weird passage in the book of Jude, just a little reference, where the archangel Michael and Satan had a dispute about the body of Moses. We don't know anything else about that. It's just one of those little things that's dropped in there. You're like, boy, I'd sure like to know a little bit more about that. But very interesting circumstances around his body nonetheless. Another piece of evidence would be the fact that Moses and Elijah are the ones who met with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. You remember that story? And what were they talking about? They were talking about the coming kingdom of God. And then you add to that the Old Testament prophecies that say, before the great and coming dreadful day of the Lord, Elijah will come. And you have at least some anecdotal evidence that possibly the identity of these two witnesses is the return of Moses and Elijah. Now, I wouldn't want to reassure anyone of that. I wouldn't want to take a hard stand on it, but it's an interesting possibility nonetheless that might be the case. But whatever the actual case of their identity is, at the end of their ministry, something specific will happen to these two witnesses. Verse 7 says that the beast who comes up out of the abyss will attack them and overpower them and indeed kill them. Now, this is the first mention that we have of the beast in the book of Revelation. Now, I myself have talked about him before because I have anticipated his arrival here. But this is the first introduction that we have to him in the actual text in Revelation. And it's very interesting that he should be mentioned here because we're really not given any specific detail about who the beast is until we get to chapter 13, which is going to be still 2 or 3 weeks ahead of us. But since I have already been talking about it, we know that the beast in the book of Revelation is this one that we call the Antichrist, or as Paul calls him, the man of lawlessness, or as Daniel calls him, the master of intrigue. Okay? Notice where he is said to arise from the abyss. Now, he himself is a man. He will not literally arise from the abyss, I'm quite convinced. But I think this is an indication that he will be possessed. Okay? He will be possessed by Satan himself. He is basically Satan's attempt to create his own Christ-like figure. But he will be evil, and he will hate the ministry of the two witnesses. And by the time that their ministry is over and God finally removes his protection from them, They will be killed, and it says that their bodies will be left to rot in the middle of the streets for 3.5 days. Okay? Now, one can only imagine this reality being beamed over television all over the world, right? Or all over the internet, or whatever, exists at that particular time. And verse 10 says, that was a short interlude between those bells, don't you think? You're going to have to send me a crying baby if you want me to quit, Verse 10 says that the whole world will rejoice at the death of these two witnesses. If Amazon is still in existence, then they'll be sending each other packages, to celebrate the Witness Dead Day. That will be the end of that. Well, the witnesses will be raised from the dead. They will be resurrected, but they will not be resurrected to continue to minister. They will be taken up to heaven. And what appears to be the case is they will minister until the end of the blowing of the trumpets. And when this seventh trumpet is about to be blown, which you will see there begins in chapter 11 and verse 15, that will end their ministry. And I kind of get the indication, it's just a hunch, but since it says that they were allowed to bring any plague that they want, I kind of get the indication that it will be these two witnesses who will be calling down the trumpet blasts, and will be bringing all of these plagues upon the earth, kind of like Moses and Aaron did in the time of the Egyptian deal. Okay, so that's the first half of chapter 11. Next week, the interlude is going to end at chapter 11 and verse 15, and the seventh angel is going to sound the final trumpet. And at that trumpet blast will come this declaration: the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. And that's where we'll pick things up next week. Okay? Thank you all for your time and attention this morning.